My last bite.
What's up, world? This is Maxwell 3000 Productions. I am Maxwell 3000. I want to welcome you again to Family Talk with my pops, Wayne Carter. Uh, Pops, glad to have you again.
Good to be here.
How's everything going in old Cleve, Vegas?
Been a busy weekend. Had a little rain this afternoon. Was kind of nice, but that makes it a lot more humid. So
Yeah, we've had a little bit of intermittent rain. Not as much as I want. Like you've said a couple of times, we're still in a drought, and my garden is still kind of thirsty. It's producing and everything, but stuff still looks like it would like a little more water. So
yeah, I got my first red tomatoes this week. I had the I got some little cherry ones, and I got some regular ones. The cherry ones have come in,
yeah, yeah,
and had some fried green tomatoes for supper last night. So
nice. Yeah, we've got a little bit of everything coming in except for the peppers. We've gotten a lot of squash, a lot of green beans, cucumber. Started picking okra today.
your okra
Uh,
coming out?
yep. I've got not a lot today, but it'll start coming on. You know how okra is.
Yeah, mine's
Uh,
just
it,
about half ant. They're just little bitty
yeah,
things right now.
yeah. Well, can't let them get too long or they'll start to get hard and stuff. So I pick them before they get really longer than my pinky. And even, so that does it pretty well, but just kind of got a handful today, but they'll really start overproducing in a week or so. And the cucumbers are blooming, got a few cucumbers, but they're finna start overproducing. And then, waiting on peppers. There, I got a lot of peppers on the plant, but none of them have ripened up to pick. And it's also kind of interesting watching the corn do its thing. I've never done corn, so that's a new experience for me. And it's not fruiting yet, but it's bloomed out and all that stuff. So see how that goes.
It's all good. It's all
Yeah,
good.
blessings is what it is.
We were talking at the men's group uh, Friday, and one of the things that we don't think about is how fortunate we are to live in an area that's kind of agriculture. We do both, but think about those people that like New York City and Detroit, Chicago, that live in the city that really don't understand and see those kind of things.
Yeah, yeah. And I was thinking about that really. Kind of involved with our conversation last week with where we grew up at and the really just the geography of the state of Tennessee and how Middle Tennessee and East Tennessee particularly um, and man, you really can kind of live off the land with really not minimal effort, but not as maybe much work as a 40-hour a week job, you know, and really just blessed to be in this place, right?
You remember that? I know we've been to Russell's Cave over,
Yeah,
and you think about the part of the message in that history, the prehistoric messages. That's why Native Americans came here in the first place. They were able to, survive and a lot of effort, but not as much effort as you would have to be, say, out west somewhere.
well, and there's so even throughout the winter months, right? You talked about some of the Native Americans here, and I want to follow up with the book and author we were talking about last week as well. But you can gather chestnuts that will that will subsistent feed you through the winter, until these other crops and things can come in. Um, and yeah, so to touch base with you on that, James Corn, he was referred to as Colonel James Corn.
That was kin to Charlie.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I wanted to know, and actually wrote 4 books about the history of the Eastern Cherokee Nation and that area. And so I'm reading Farewell the Hills, which is a novel of the Eastern Cherokee Nation, which is a lot of history in it, but he kind of made up some stories to blend some things together. You know how that goes. But we talked a little bit last time about how you enjoyed history, and particularly Tennessee history. And man, that is what it's all about. And these characters like Andrew Jackson and Davy Crockett and Sam Houston and John Ross and all these guys that we kind of know about in this Tennessee lore and maybe don't know about as much. I wonder if I'm not sure that my children have been exposed to that kind of Tennessee history and lore the same way that I was, and maybe me subsequently the same way y'all were. I don't really remember a Tennessee history class in my primary education.
Yeah, we had one. I remember it was a red textbook, and I probably told you this story, but I guess it was in the maybe late 50s, Walt Disney had a series out about Davy Crockett.
Yeah.
And I remember that. And then when I got to reading Tennessee history and got to that textbook, there was a picture of Davy Crockett. And I remember being just devastated that was not the Davy Crockett from the Disney movie, you know.
Yeah, yeah. And that was old Fess Parker, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And didn't he also play another TV
Play
series?
Daniel Boone.
Daniel Boone, yeah. So
See, in my mind, as a young child, well, they were just cousins, Kentucky, Tennessee, they were related,
Yeah. And in a real way, that's kind of true. But there's also a lot of legend and kind of falsehood built around some of those names as well. And so it's important to get the true stories of some of these guys. And really, I think Davy Crockett is like a really famous Tennessean, and rightfully so. But Sam Houston was a very interesting and kind of romantic character in his own right, and just some very interesting stuff about
the only guy that I think, you fact check me on this, but I think Sam Houston's the only guy to ever be the governor of 2 states.
Yeah, and
almost the emperor of Texas.
Was he a president? Of Texas for a little while as well?
President, and they were going to make him emperor, but he didn't want to be emperor.
Yeah. There's a lot of different aspects to history, and a lot of these guys were I think it's fair to say were kind of our heroes. When we were younger, especially kind of coming from Tennessee, and then some of what happened in Texas, when we look at it critically, kind of is a detriment to their character, or maybe shows some of their flaws, But what's interesting, just in the case of like Davy Crockett, is how hard he fought for the Cherokee Nation against Andrew Jackson, and then how he kind of supported Houston and what Houston was trying to do in Texas. There's really kind of the duality of man in that,
Yeah.
So it's very interesting, and there's a lot of stuff. We also were talking about this idea of the American dream. right? And I think that goes back to really all of our national narrative or this patriotic propaganda that you know we're kind of indoctrinated with through the public education. And this isn't a critique on the United States necessarily. Countries do that, right? If we look at it from the older philosophical point of view, right? The nation is the spirit of the people and all that type of stuff. Well, you have to have a narrative to create a spirit, right? But this idea, that you and I like to talk about freedom and liberty and what the kind of founders of our nation were aspiring to, while at the same time, you know, um, committing most heinous civil civil liberty infractions that there were, and we talk about that original conflict, right? That you've articulated so well with that 3/5 law and that stuff, and we find that in the history of Tennessee with the dealing of the Cherokee Nation, right? And so much history is right there.
And
Um,
specifically Andrew Jackson.
Right. Yes. Yes. Exactly. Yes. And how he promised, in presidents in the past, Washington had made treaties with the Cherokee Nation, and other presidents had kind of just stayed within that policy, and Jackson utilized those relationships when it was beneficial to fight the Creeks, and then as soon as it was more beneficial to take the land for gold rights and other resources, he switched on them, right? And we start really pushing this idea of manifest destiny and all that, right?
Yeah, there's not a real good reason for other countries in the world to trust us that we have really broken every treaty we've ever made.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I just think about all of that, and then how that impacted your parents' idea of the American dream and your idea of the American dream, along with those life experiences, right? I think we mentioned last time probably how um, the Depression era and just how big of a deal that really was, um, and how folks coming out of that, the nation really coming out of that, had a particular maybe set of values and even priorities, right?
Yeah, I thought about that American dream thing. I think that probably mom and dad's vision of the American dream was to own a home, was to have a piece of property, was to do that. Um, and I guess all of us in a way, but again, I think I mentioned my idea of the American dream is freedom of movement, freedom of
Yeah,
liberty.
yeah, right, and that's what's very interesting, and what the liberty entails, right, is really what changes and maybe has developed over time, right, where in some respects, owning just the small farm, not a corporate farm, but just a subsistence farm, to kind of really the lifestyle of the Cherokee Nation and the kind of agriculture they had, where they had small farms and you produced just enough of your corn or whatever crop that you produced to kind of exchange for things that you couldn't get naturally, right? And it wasn't really for profit necessarily, and it certainly wasn't to raise the stock price or increase shareholders' interest, right? And maybe that changed or maybe it was different for other people, where some people maybe thought that the freedom to engage in commerce, the freedom to be able to exploit resources to gain capital, and having that type of freedom just to do that,
Well,
right?
I think the big difference, I was going to say for our country, but I suspect worldwide, was the Industrial Revolution,
Sure.
where you get out of that idea of, like you say, subsiding for our local survivor, to the idea of we can make a mass group of these things and sell it and start making money.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting, and there's really maybe a lot of that duality in the founding of America, right? That there were some of those people that were looking for that, just that freedom to kind of be able to sustain themselves in that
Right.
small farmer aspect. But there were certainly those corporations, right, that came here to make a profit for their shareholders through exploiting the natural resources
Well,
and
even
kind of,
before the Industrial Revolution, you had that concept, particularly from England, to come and get those items. Logging was a big deal. The farm, particularly the development of tobacco.
yes.
Those
And
things that were selling big in Europe.
yeah, and rice, right? Tobacco in Virginia and kind of rice in South Carolina, and the complex slave system that was built on both of those colonies, right? And that speaks to that duality and maybe that conflict, right? We speak a lot about like John Locke and his comments on natural rights and natural freedoms, but he was also a founding shareholder of the corporation that established that system in South Carolina, right? So,
But I don't think any of those guys back in those days would have envisioned a worldwide economy.
ooh, I don't know about that. We might have to revisit that another time because I think that's exactly what they were doing, right? They were
I think they
developing.
envisioned an economy that would affect them and their, maybe even protect their state or their country, but not something that's going to affect what we do here is going to affect trade in China. I don't think anybody envisioned that.
Well, and maybe I think you're given. That idea of international trade had been going on for a very long time, and that's these guys were certainly trying to find their way to build that capital, build the wealth, right? That they had
Sure,
seen kind
absolutely,
of
absolutely,
other
yeah.
the merchant classes do, right? And we, can go into all that in world history.
But I think
Um,
when the Industrial Revolution hit and we started mechanizing so much, I think when people like Ford and those guys, they envisioned at that point this we could control our market throughout the world.
yeah, I think it expanded it. Yes, for sure.
But
But
anyway,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That's interesting. So, in a roundabout way, that connects back to what we were talking about as far as this lifestyle of what I'm saying, seeking the freedom in the natural world and kind of appreciating really our geographic location. And I had asked you kind of when you had started kind of the outdoor sports and things like that and kind of enjoying um, those aspects. And you had mentioned this group at church at a young age. And I just got to thinking that, that's really just part of the culture in Tennessee, right? And we have a great state park system. right? We are one of the most biodiverse regions in the country and really in the world, right? What is it? The Duck River over here near Columbia is one of the most biodiverse rivers in the world. And we've kind of got a rich history of, you can really call it environmental activism in the state, even before it was really called that. I mean, when we go back to the Cherokee Nation, right? There were um, that's kind of was what they were dealing with is people wanting to come in and take land rights for logging and to exploit other resources, right? And there's really just a long history of that. Do you think, were you exposed to any of those aspects of it, or when did you kind of become aware of that?
I think that the one of the awareness came up probably in when the Nissan plant came to Smyrna. All of a sudden, you begin to realize that okay, our agriculture, our that kind of stuff is going away, and the leadership of Tennessee is now bringing industrialized stuff to make more important than agriculture. And you see, I'm sorry, hold on a second, Lisa, could y'all go in the other room? Um, I think that's when we started to see the leadership of particularly Tennessee started moving more toward industrial stuff. And if you look at what's happening since then, uh, that's exactly what's happened in Tennessee. So some of that stuff become aware of it because it was different than what we saw growing up, and it's kind of disturbing in my view right now.
Yeah, but hmm. And didn't that kind of the same thing kind of happened with the industrialization of agriculture as well,
Well,
right? A lot of Tennessee's natural lands have been cleared for the use of agriculture, right? And now we kind of see people complain about the agricultural land being converted to warehouse or industry type space. But the clearing of the natural land was almost just as much of a sin or just as much of a detriment, the clearing of the natural land for agriculture in on that scale, right?
on that scale, the difference, at least in my mind, is in the agriculture, you're still producing some type of vegetation, and it's vegetation that that produces the air and oxygen that we all need to survive. And if you continue to clear off it and putting concrete down and building it down, where I mean, you know yourself in Brazil, for example, the rainforests right now are being clear cut, and there's a real concern about how that's going to affect our ability to survive the planet. But we don't seem to be talking about that much.
Yeah. No. So that's interesting, and I wonder kind of there was a relationship you talked about with your idea of being free and kind of being able to travel and live and work and study as you wanted. Was there any, did you kind of feel that, you know, home was always going to be there until maybe you started seeing these other developments happen? Or did you have any consciousness of that?
Yeah, I think so. Uh, I think um, probably wouldn't until till Dad passed away that I realized uh, that there is it's not permanent, that there's not a fallback. Even though I don't think I ever really uh, relied upon mom and dad ability to help. I just knew it was there, and so yeah.
And so that's you said something that really kind of reinforces some things that I was thinking about, and kind of some comparisons of maybe, the story of our family reflecting the story of America, reflecting the story of Tennesseans and reflecting the stories of Americans, right? And we talked about how you didn't feel like what your folks American dream wasn't your American dream, and how you thought of them having and owning that home and having that kind of security, right? And maybe coming out of, these really hard economic times and these times when the whole world was at war and dealing with some of these so-called existential problems of industrialization, right? And so, and not only the industrialization of agriculture as well as production, okay, and production as well, like cars and things like that. And so I can see how your parents, coming from predominantly this agrarian lifestyle growing up, and seeing really the expansion of the Industrial Revolution in America through World War II, right? Kind of being nervous about how am I going to provide this security, right? And, that trade and the ability to work, the unions provided that security for your father, right? And so that allowed you to be at that next stage in life, right? Where you still kind of grew up poor, although us being where we live at in Tennessee, and us being able having this tradition of agriculture and kind of husbandry with the land, we always kind of eat good out of the garden, and we talk about that now, and that's always been something that's kind of lasted through us. And there's that poem about your Uncle Charlton, being poor is not so bad if you don't know it, and that kind of idea. But you also mentioned how, Laverne was kind of across the tracks or whatever, you know what I mean, so to speak, and kind of the rough guys kind of came from that side of Rutherford County and stuff like that. But you had that security in what Granddad had created, and maybe you didn't depend on them for all of your physical needs, but he provided you that trade, right? And you kind of always knew that you had a job. You had that freedom to go maybe explore these other things. If college didn't work out, you knew you could go work with Granddad, right? Military is a pretty sure deal, but you didn't, you kind of expressed you didn't want to do that your whole life. So you knew you could always go back to construction, right? Do you think that maybe allowed you the American dream to kind of progress in that sense?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it until you put it like that. I think it's totally accurate.
And then, so it's very interesting what we're kind of doing, and there's some academic theory behind it, because if we kind of fast forward to me, right, and we went with your parents kind of from this agrarian lifestyle to a industrialist kind of lifestyle, and kind of depending on industry really for the livelihood. And what that created for you was the ability to pursue your education, right? And you pursuing your education, you were able to reach the middle class, reach what might be called the bourgeois middle class, right, as an elite professional, right? And so for me, right, the American dream is to be able to provide for yourself while expressing yourself through art or in another sense, right? And so some kind of social scientists might say those ideas aren't possible for the subsistence farmer in that early agrarian industrial lifestyle. You know, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. There are always exceptions, but I think that's probably a general rule. Yeah.
Well, and maybe not a general rule, but just some observations that can be made. You know, so I kind of find those things interesting.
Yeah.
And we've kind of we've talked about a lot without talking about it, and that's really interesting to me too. But I kind of want to spin what I just said on its head, because we cannot say that you have to be of the bourgeois to appreciate art or to even experience art. You know, we were also talking last time about some of the media you consumed and some of the music that you appreciated, and throughout our conversations we talked about the music that kind of your parents listened to, and we can follow a progression through that, right? In America as well. But something that I kind of noticed that you were into were like voice harmonies. You know, the Beach Boys, the Mamas and the Papas you mentioned. You know what I'm saying? Peter, Paul, and Mary you mentioned. You know what I'm saying? And so, and you talk about the early Beatles even, right? It's really playing on those voice harmonies. And you also talked about how throughout kind of with church, you did a lot of singing and kind of were involved in those voice harmonies as well. What's interesting to me is that's a lot of the same stuff that the Carter family was doing. And when I say the Carter family, I mean the musicians, right? No, not necessarily related to us. We're doing even before, that's kind of before your parents' generation, right? You know, they might have listened to that a little bit, but that would have been pretty early on, right? But it's all about those
Yeah.
harmonies in the voices, right?
Yeah. I hadn't really thought about that either. But yeah, there's some kind of a net connection there. Yeah.
Well, and I even remember growing up, you know, we would all sing, right? And we would hit the harmony, we would hit those harmonies together, right? And I am not a good singer. You're a better singer than I am for sure, but I think both of us, I think it's fair to say that the girls far more talented than either one of us, right? But being able to match the harmony really adds kind of texture to the sounds. And I recall us kind of just doing that as kind of passing entertainment around the house sometimes. And I remember being at grandma and granddad's, and you know, us engaging in music with them, just kind of sitting around in the garage sometimes, and being those older songs. Is that something that carried through your life that you just didn't really think about, that kind of happened and then just carried on into being a parent as well?
Well, yeah, and I think the Southern gospel music was a big influence, because that's what particularly mom did, but mom and dad, and then that from the church, and then that we enjoyed it. You know, you're our early age.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it just seems like that's something that I kind of notice in our family history that maybe is not really highlighted, but it's like consistently there. I remember Granddad playing the jaw harp, right? I remember playing the washboard and the spoons, and you know, kind of learning how to play that with them, and then kind of learning how to match the harmonies, messing around with you and the girls, and then, you know, obviously the training that my mother and Rachel have had in the music realm far surpasses all of that. But it's just like something that was always a consistent thread that was there. Um, were you engaged in any of that during this time when you were kind of in college and going through your enlistment career? Um, were y'all? I know you. We've talked about y'all being involved in church. Did y'all express yourselves like that through choir and different things at church?
Yeah, yeah. Pretty much always been involved in a choir up until just real recently.
Yeah, yeah. Right. Um, Now we say now we can look at it now and say, you know, that was probably really important to provide balance. Was that something that was intentional, or was it just what you did as part of your normal? It was more of a routine, right? And that's how you kept life being normal, is to stay in a routine.
Yeah, routines is one way, but you know, it was also part of the church life and part of the praise or worship of God was to be not a spectator but a participant.
Okay, that's interesting. That's interesting. Okay, well, you've given me a lot to think about, and I'm really chewing on a lot of this stuff. I think I'm almost ready for you to have some kids and stuff like that, and get back to this narration. But once again, I kind of want to take our time with that as well. But I was thinking back and looking back on our old conversations, and kind of chronologically, we are still really in the fall of 1979, right? And in your first year, your first semester of law school. And so I was looking at everything, and Rachel being born in December, I guess you kind of got the news of expecting a child and the acceptance in law school close to the same time. Does that seem right?
Probably, yeah.
Um, because I think you said, you know, I was just not trying to be too nosy, but just thinking of things biologically. You probably know at the latest May, June, if you're expecting, and you said it was somewhere around the early to midsummer, you got the acceptance letter from Nashville School of Law, right?
Yeah, I don't know that I don't really remember when it was that your mother told me that she was pregnant with Rachel. I do remember the idea of, okay, I probably don't need to be doing law school
Yes.
and that whole thing. So
Yeah, you talked about that, and so we really don't need to revisit that first semester, I don't think, because we kind of covered that in depth. But in thinking about that and kind of the anxiety of taking on this academic pursuit while a newborn in the house and learning all of that, and the new you know, all of the parental responsibilities that go with it. Um, and then you've also talked about failing that first exam, right? And how maybe like traumatic that was, you know, and really felt like, you know, you were kind of second guessing it, right?
yeah,
And,
absolutely.
and the whole plan. Um, and man, what a difference things would be if you would have made a different decision in that moment, right? Um, and so I want to pause right there. And when we pick up, I think I'm going to be ready to maybe dive into some of those feelings as far as taking on law school and putting in all that work in the first semester, and then kind of being let down on the exam, and then kind of how we overcome, if that's all right.
All right.
All right, cool tools. Well, I appreciate you again, Pops. This has been Maxwell 3000 Productions. I am Maxwell 3000. Peace and love.